Okay, hello everybody. Sorry for our minute late. I welcome you to our today's talk. It's a bit special as it's the first one which will be held in English. So please do not blame me for any mistakes I'm making, as I'm not a natural speaker. I welcome Molly Scott Cato, former member of the European Parliament and a passionate European, I would say, and I heard designate one of the Green Party for the next seat in the House of Lords for the Greens. Am I right?
You are.
Okay, and I welcome Ross Greer, member of the Scottish Parliament, and we both have one thing in common. We are both the youngest members of our chambers in history, so it's might be a very interesting talk. And Antonia Dambach, she's my student intern, and she will handle questions and technical stuff. If there's everything and you write it, she will answer you. Ross have to leave us in a few minutes, but just for a few minutes. So he will be back as voting sessions in the Scottish Parliament are still going on, but they are about today's topic. So there will be a voting about the internal market bill. Maybe he will give us an insight into this later on as well. Molly will start with a short statement and her view on how is Brexit changing Britain, and afterwards Ross will follow and we will go in discussion, and you all have your opportunity to ask your questions either by writing them to us with the question tool or by taking the microphone. Just use the raise your hand button for this. Molly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for having the what can I say, the patience and the resilience to listen to yet more stuff about Brexit. I'm sure we'd all be rather be doing many other things. And thank you also for continuing solidarity with what is such a difficult time for my country. I've been so cheered really and warmed by the affection I've had, especially from German colleagues, and I've got to say I think this is because you know what it means when a country falls apart, and my country is spectacularly falling apart right now. So thank you. Let me start with that. I would say that one of the, of course, it's a tragedy. Brexit's a tragedy and a disaster for the UK, and it looks a bit different from Scotland, as Ross will say in a minute. But the biggest tragedy for me is the timing, because if we'd waited just a little bit longer, we would have certainly had a majority in favour. Some people are changing their minds, but the most important thing is that the people that wanted Brexit were the older people, and the people who didn't want it are the younger people. So as time goes on, this bad decision will be a decision supported by fewer and fewer people. And I find it really hard to imagine how that's going to work in a democracy where the biggest thing that's, I think, very destructive, but anyway, having enormous impacts, is something that most people in the country, and an increasing number, didn't actually want. The margin between people who would support it and not is now about 10 points. But, you know, it can only grow over time as people see the negative impacts and as more young people come to voting age. And also, it was obviously really close because COVID has completely changed the dynamic, I think, and our understanding of what systems we need to be in and how we need to work together with other countries. And I'm convinced that if COVID had come even 6 months earlier, we would have been able to stop Brexit. So to me, somebody who, as you say, is passionately opposed to Brexit, it's extremely painful to think how near we were to actually stopping it. But anyway, we didn't do that, and we're in the long haul now. Personally, I don't see any point in arguing to return at this point, to rejoin right now. You know, people have constantly said that the reasons I've given against Brexit were lies and Project Fear and so on. So we're going to have to live through the reality of Brexit now, and it will be damaging and difficult, and it will be painful, and jobs will be lost, and people will learn that, you know, what we said during the referendum was the truth and that they were lied to. And that again is something that very much stresses a democracy, I think, being promised something that's impossible by a bunch of crooks who are now unfortunately running our government. We risk, as you know, a lot of serious impacts on the country. I mean, I come from an agricultural area, and farmers will have trouble exporting, but what's much more serious is that The government seems determined to strike a trade deal with the US, where they have really appalling food and farming standards. And then my farmers will be undercut by US farmers, and we will have disgusting US food on our supermarket shelves. Pricing good quality British food out of the market. It's just one example, really, of the many, many ways that leaving the EU will be very destructive. I'm an economist, so I think about those things first, but I also think that really the worst impacts are for young people, and I feel ashamed and horrified that we are depriving young people of the opportunities we had, and that freedom of movement was seen as a way of stopping people coming into our country and was never discussed in terms of the huge opportunities it offered young people to travel. And people are going to find this out. Old ladies are going to find out they can't take their dog on holiday because they don't have a pet passport. People are going to get charged more for credit cards and phone bills, and young people can't work. The whole thing is going to unravel, wind its way out in horrific reality over the next few years, starting with motorways filled with trucks, in January. So anyway, there we are. Let's just think a little bit now about the negotiations, because I think you asked me, how is this impacting on Britain? And I always said during the referendum campaign that it isn't possible to make Brexit happen democratically. And I rather felt that was a sort of fatal argument for the Brexit project. But unfortunately, what's happened is that the government has decided to abandon democracy in order to make Brexit happen. And we're seeing really serious attacks on the rule of law and democratic standards. I mean, Britain has never really been a proper democracy. I mean, you said I'm, on the list to be a member of the House of Lords, which is an absurd second chamber where somebody's great-great-great-grandfather killed somebody, and so they got a peerage, or you gave the Conservative Party some money, you get a peerage. So yes, there's many ways in which Britain needs to become a democracy, but even so, we did have basic standards which were not transgressed, and all of that's been blown apart by this government. And that comes directly out of a decision that was reached in an undemocratic and illegitimate process. And the Vote Leave campaign were found to have broken electoral law, and those people are now the government. So it's not surprising that they're now threatening to break international law, because they've got where they are through breaking rules, breaking laws, lying and cheating. So it's not really very surprising. But anyway, to be a little bit more hopeful about this, I think in Britain we've had a need for a long time now to re-examine our history. British people, mostly, not Scottish people, but most certainly English people, drift along with a kind of rosy sentiment about what the British Empire was like, and this idea of global Britain is sort of part of a delusion that somehow people in India or Malaysia or Kenya enjoyed the British Empire as much as we did. And it's a terrible delusion, but a majority delusion in England, I would say. That's all. The fact that that's such a big lie does give us an opportunity to re-examine our past in a way that we've never done and we've really needed to do, and to look at the British Empire honestly and to atone for our crimes, our past crimes. And that, I believe, will give us an opportunity to move on to be a better country. But it's not going to be an easy process. So Brexit is bringing up all these issues, and on good days I feel, well, there's a great opportunity to do all that rethinking that we should have done really decades ago. Just say a quick word now about what we're doing to keep close to Europe. I'm on the board of the European movement, which actually was founded by Winston Churchill in 1949 and was part of the movement that took us into Europe, but obviously hasn't been as needed while we've been members of the EU, but has now really come to the fore as an organisation that's working to keep us close, to keep good relations, because it's actually easy, frighteningly easy, I think, for us to slip away and become a sort of isolated country in the North Atlantic. And obviously, none of us want that to happen. So the European movement is keeping people in touch. And yeah, I think it's a good organisation to do that. And it's also, it has a slogan, which is maintaining our access, protecting our standards. So it's about making sure that we still have economic relationships with the EU, and that we don't allow that, you know, our standards to be cut, whether it's on food and farming or on tax avoidance or workers' rights or whatever. This government certainly wants to attack those standards, and the European movement is saying, no, we need to really protect them. So, yeah, so to me, it's all about how do we find ways of staying close, of keeping good relationships when they're not automatically there through our membership of the EU. And I would say I really appreciate the work that Terry Reinke is doing in the European Parliament with her UK-EU friendship group. And she's got some really good people in that group. And yeah, it's heartwarming that she does that, but also I think it'll go increasingly important that we do keep those connections between politicians, because diplomacy is one of the things that Britain, you know, used to think it was good at, and has, like, you know, it's like anti-diplomacy what we do now. It's like how to insult friends and, you know, alienate everybody. So all those connections at the political level are really important, and that's why it's nice that you've invited me and Ross to speak here. But there's also opportunities, I think, for business cooperation. And also cooperation over energy and climate change. It makes no sense to think about climate change as one country. And I think the best example we have is the interconnectors to support the transfer of renewable energy across Europe. Of course, Britain still needs to be a part of that. You know, we need to connect our energy systems with European energy systems, and we'll have to keep to European product standards if we're going to sell into the European market. It makes no sense to develop all our own standards, and anyway, the government hasn't done it. So if you're a business person, you're still going to carry on having those relationships with the European organizations, sticking to the European standards. And I think that, you know, it does give us a way of keeping connected, I think. And lastly, and certainly from an emotional point of view, most importantly, we have to keep our young people in contact with other young Europeans. You know, when I was at school, which was a long time ago, but just, yeah, we joined the European Union when I was 11, and twinning organisations were a huge thing then. You know, I grew up in Bath, and we had a twinning link with Braunschweig, and so everybody went there, and Alkmaar in Holland, and Aix-en-Provence, actually rather nice places. And Bristol, that was down the road, they were twinned with Bordeaux, and so, you know, all the schools did exchanges. And please, please, let's make things like that happen, because we don't want to become isolated. Young people don't want to become isolated. We really need to push hard in our country to keep us in Erasmus. You know, with this government, who knows, but all those opportunities that young people had to become young Europeans, there's no reason why they should lose those opportunities. And let's sort of commit to doing what we can from the British side, but also, I hope, from the German side, to make sure our young people are the next generation of Europeans, because they're the people that are going to take us back into the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So I guess Ross will now roundabout leave us for a few minutes, but we have a few questions to your input, which we will come in a minute. I just wanted to say one thing. Because the very last thing you mentioned about youth exchange, you were talking about one of my hard topics. So youth exchange is one of my major topics as European spokesman, and we had a hearing on this and really tried to push it, especially in the next year after hopefully Corona will have left us, so we can establish more links to Britain as well, to take young people on a European path. But let's start with the first question.
That's great, but let me just say, in a way, I think COVID gives us more opportunities for twinning, doesn't it? Because, like I said, when we joined the European Union, what was it, like 8 or 9 countries then? But now, you know, we could all invite somebody from Zagreb to this webinar tonight, and they can join us. So I mean, the travel's going to be great once we get through this COVID crisis. We will be traveling again, and that's really, you know, there's nothing like that. But we can also start to bring other people in through these virtual connections. I think we should really profit from that. Once we don't actually need it anymore, let's still use it.
Yeah, great idea. So e-twinning is something we are working on as well, to get an idea of how to establish new links. So it's a good way to establish new links, but as well to strengthen those who are there in the moment, and where of course visits are not possible. But Antonia, maybe if there is something who wants to take the floor, you can activate his or her microphone.
Yeah, so we actually have several questions from Susanne Völpel, and she also raised her hand, so I would just unmute your microphone for a minute now.
Hello, I'm Suzanne. I've implemented a lot of questions to you already. First of all, Molly, let me tell you how pleased I am to finally hear a voice again from the UK. And of course, every German would be happy to get you back, because you're not only the sense of humor of Europe, you're also the sense of reason in the European Union. And of course, we want to get the British and especially the Scottish back to the European Union. And it was so sad to see what happened during the last year. It seemed that the reason has left the island, but I'm glad that this week's news showed somehow everything is going to turn. And my first question was, isn't the star of Boris Johnson now on the fall? Reading the newspapers of this week, hadn't there been a turnaround, and not at least because of Keir Starmer, your charming new Labour chairman? Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your kind words about, yeah, I hope we're not just doing all this as some enormous kind of comedy routine to keep you all entertained. Sometimes perhaps it would be better if it were that. But the trouble is with British politics that Boris Johnson may go, but we will still have a Conservative government. And the nature of our electoral system means that, you know, we are likely to have another Conservative government, because the Conservatives get more votes than anybody else in more seats than anybody else. So even though they got 43% in the election last December, they have all the power, and that's obviously part of the reason I said our country's not really a democracy. I hear that Boris Johnson doesn't want to be Prime Minister because it turned out to be much harder than he thought, and he doesn't get paid enough. And he, as you probably know, has various former wives and children and houses and complications that are quite expensive. So, I mean, I'm saying this with a feeling of utter disgust, which I hope comes across. But anyway, but if he leaves, then it's a very nasty choice, because he's filled his cabinet with Brexiteers. The person who comes next will not be an improvement. So anyway, that path looks bleak. In terms of Keir Starmer, Labour decided that they will not talk about Brexit because they've lost a lot of votes. The Conservatives used Brexit to win the election by undermining Labour. So Labour won't oppose Brexit. And this is a big problem again in British politics, because almost all the power goes to the government and the opposition. If the government and the opposition's duty is to oppose. It didn't do that. Labour didn't do that for party reasons. If the opposition doesn't oppose, you know, you can't stop something no matter how bad. And that's why Brexit's happening. So, you know, what I'm trying to do is to get Labour to work with other parties so that we agree that in the next election we have a joint platform basically for significant constitutional reform and a fair voting system. Then we never have a Conservative government again. But Labour at the moment are preferring a Conservative government than sharing seats and votes and power with Greens and others. So we're a bit stuck at the minute, to be honest.
But isn't the economy now making a move? Aren't there several business people now having a word with the government, reminding them of the bad figures in the economy at the moment? So many unemployment rates, not only because of Corona, but also because of companies are leaving.
Yeah, but you know, you're talking from Germany, which is a country that is properly governed by a government that's seeking the benefit of most people and listens to business and listens to other interests. That's not the country I'm living in. I'm living in a country where a small group of highly ideological people want to carry out a kind of revolution in terms of our institutions and how our economy works. So, and who knows who they're working for? It's not clear. So, your arguments would make sense in a rational, well-governed country, but I'm sorry to say Britain isn't that at the moment.
Thank you, Susanne. I've seen you have more questions. We will mix them in later on. I just have one short before Ross will be back. You mentioned, interestingly, Winston Churchill, who gave years ago a recognized speech, I guess, in Zurich, where he talked about the United States of Europe. I'm sometimes using this in a European pub quiz and asking and asking the young people who gave those speech years ago. And what was I asking myself was, where has this European spirit went in Britain? Which obviously,
well, look, I would say Winston Churchill is a bit of a double-edged sword, really, because he was a huge supporter of empire. And so he never really saw Britain as being one of an equal group of European states. He always, and his mother was American, as you probably know, so he always saw Britain as the bridge between Europe and America. And he may have said that about a united Europe of states, because of course the war marked him very strongly, as it did many politicians of his generation and younger generations. But he was a great one for making speeches, not necessarily for following through. And I'm not 100% convinced that he would have wanted Britain. I think he would have suffered from exactly the problem some of the Brexiteers do. They want Britain to be the big country on the world stage. This is what I was saying about our history and needing to readdress our history. You know, we need to do what countries like Sweden have done and realize we're not a global power anymore. We're not an imperial superpower anymore. We're a country that could be a good, decent, happy place to live with other countries working together for the same. And I see that. Too many people in my country don't see that, but I don't think Winston Churchill would ever have seen that. But more importantly, Margaret Thatcher would never have countenanced what the current Conservatives are doing, because even though she was seen as anti-European, she helped build the single market. You know, that was, in a way, many British Tories contributed to that. And the Conservative Party traditionally has understood the economic benefits of being in the EU. And so, yeah, it's a very recent thing. And although the more extreme Brexit people in the Tory party very much sort of bring Margaret Thatcher in, she absolutely would not have been on their side. She was a pragmatist. She wasn't this kind of ideological crazy like the Brexiteers are.
Thanks. I just will ask Antonia if there's somebody else who wants to take the floor before Ross will be back.
Yes. So we have one more raised hand by Volker. I'm going to unmute you now. 1 second. You should be able to speak.
Now it's unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm referring to a webinar we had some days ago. And since you talked about the regional government, I thought it might be time to ask the question. What would you think of a future where Great Britain would scrap tariffs and force European Union either to enforce border to Northern Ireland or other border sites from the European Union? What would you say to such an imagination? Thank you.
Well, so obviously in the negotiations, the British government has decided to play this kind of chicken game, you know, threatening things, hoping the EU will back down, because that actually, I'm afraid to say, did partially work in the last round of negotiations a year ago. But I'm hoping that Barnier will stick to his guns this time and be very clear that, you know, access to the single market without tariffs will require us to stick to single market rules. And obviously the British government think that their argument is, well, the Germans want to sell us their cars. You know, if we can't sell to Germany, we won't buy German goods. But they've already said in a contrasting statement that they won't stop European goods coming. even if there isn't an arrangement at the end of the year. But they have now set up a tariff regime, which obviously is the same for all countries of the world. And if those tariffs were imposed on British exporters, which I assume would be the case, then many of them would not be able to export and would go out of business. So, you know, I mean, I think what Barnier says is right. I assume the German presidency supports that, and I completely support it myself. And when I voted against the Brexit withdrawal agreement, last year, I did that not because I loathe Brexit, although I do, but I did that as a European because I thought Barnier had given way too much, both on the Irish border, which is a bad arrangement and an arrangement that the British government has now said they're not even going to follow through with, and also in terms of the level playing field, which is about sticking to the same standards. He allowed that to be moved from the legally binding withdrawal agreement, where it was under the May deal, into the political declaration. So it's now again being negotiated. So I think that he already gave way too much in the first round, and he has to be made to keep the European single market and the European project strong. That's his priority, and that's my priority. And I also believe that's the priority of the German presidency, and I hope that my colleagues, my former colleagues in the European Parliament, will also hold that line. And if Barnier shows signs of buckling, then they will refuse to pass the deal, because the priority here is that Brexit is not allowed to trash what has been achieved in the European Union, because that's keeping the peace in Europe, it's building prosperity in Europe, it's keeping high standards, it's enabling us to use those standards to improve standards elsewhere. For example, China now signing up to carbon neutrality by 2060. I believe that's a direct result of European diplomacy and European trade policy. So this is the power of the EU, and Brexit and some ideological conservatives must not be allowed to destroy that.
Yeah, even if we have many problems, of course, in the European Union, until now, the member states have proven to stay together in the question of Brexit. What's a bit of interesting that there are many questions where member states in the Union are, not as close as they should be. But in case of Brexit, until yet, it's one voice speaking from the European Union. And it's interesting because I thought one of the ideas of the Brexiteers was to just make lots of bilateral arrangements with every state, try to pick the roses, you say, to get something
cherry
done.
picking,
cherry picking.
They've tried to do that, but as you say, the first thing they did was go to all the European capitals and try to pick off individual members. But they did, as you say, hang together. And I think whatever else goes wrong between European capitals, and it's largely not the European institutions, it's the member state governments that are so destructive in Europe, in my view. But whatever else they do that's not good, and we can all think of plenty of examples, they recognise Brexit as an existential threat, and they put those other things to one side to protect the EU, which I take some heart from, actually.
Okay, Ross is not here again, so voting might take a few minutes as well, so we can have a next question. Antonia, is there a written one or so to Molly?
Yeah, one question, for example, was about the role of the privatization of state services, such as the national health system.
Mm-hmm.
This would be an interesting point.
Yeah, and how that relates to Brexit, you mean? Yeah, well, as I said, there's a certain group of people, or there's a number of groups that are working together to drive Brexit, really, and certainly some of those are offshoots of US, I would say, well, let's not say far right, because it's not political, but let's say extreme market liberal organizations, like the Atlas Foundation is an example of this, which was, is in awe of Ayn Rand and that total abolition of the state, really. So that a lot of the arguments that have been made have said we don't want European rules holding back business. You know, business should be free to make money in any way it wants. That's definitely a key strand of the argument for Brexit. And so NHS privatisation and the ability for US corporations to come in and buy up the National Health Service is definitely a part of the agenda here. And so if there was a US trade deal, you know, that they certainly would want to have that included. And if we become very weak and vulnerable because we only get a thin deal with the EU or no deal, then the temptation will be to allow the US to, you know, we'll look weak. The US will have this desire and this demand for US corporations to buy our health corporations, and the British government won't feel able to refuse that, or will even want to agree that. And I'm sure you know that, you know, people say that the National Health Service is like the equivalent of a national religion in the UK, and it's true. Almost, you know, more 99%, I would say, think that you should have fully public health system. And it's just iconic in our politics. In a way, it isn't in other countries. But so, yeah, this is something that, again, we argued during the referendum. People didn't believe it. It would be terribly unpopular. But with this government, with their majority, I'm not convinced we'd be able to stop it.
Thank you. So as long as Ross is not here, I think
that's all right. You keep them coming.
Oh, there are plenty questions. So Molly, I guess if you want to, you can answer questions the next hour.
Well, we all know what it's like in parliaments. You think it's going to be a short vote, but it never works out that way.
So I think what would also be interesting would be your, maybe also your personal view on the situation with Ireland and Northern Ireland at the border in the case of a hard Brexit, especially.
Whatever happens from now, that is a problem, actually. So, yeah, I grew up during the Troubles, what we call the Troubles, but what was really a civil war played out in one part of the UK as a consequence of, again, our colonial history not having been adequately resolved. And as I said, I lived in Bath. We had a bomb in Bath, even in sort of sleepy, quiet Bath. There was a bomb, and yeah, it was a frightening time on the mainland, as we said then. And I went to Belfast myself, and the poverty and the destruction caused by that time was just shocking. And of course, we can never go back to that time, and everybody says that. But the reality is that wherever you put a border, even if you put it in the Irish Sea, you automatically raise this question of reuniting Ireland. And that automatically then becomes a political battle, which we just don't want to see. The beauty of the Good Friday Agreement was that it sidelined that argument about whether there should be a united Ireland. And over time, I think that would have happened naturally. But to do this now, to inject all that energy into that question, which was really the question at the heart of 30 years of violent struggle, is very damaging. It just hasn't been long enough for people to accept that. And it's such a shame, because we've moved into a situation now in Northern Ireland where instead of voting along sectarian lines, people had started voting, as they do in other countries, about health issues or, you know, transport issues and so on. And so to bring that issue right back is just so disappointing. But it's interesting that if you poll Conservative Party members, they are totally unconcerned about Northern Ireland becoming a part of Ireland and about Scotland becoming independent, actually. Although their party is called the Conservative and Unionist Party, meaning that they are the people who wanted Northern Ireland to stay with Great Britain, you know, they are actually not concerned. But I'm deeply concerned, because I just don't feel that the peace process is long-lasting and stable enough to have this new sort of injection of political energy put into it. So, yeah, I mean, again, the EU has done the right thing, and the US has also come in now and said very clearly we won't get a trade deal if the British government does anything to undermine the Good Friday Agreement. But I just think the whole question has become a live question in a way that in itself is quite damaging. Hooray, Ross is back.
Welcome back. So yeah, there had been some issues on the new online voting system. I can feel your problems, as we have an electronic voting system now as well, and some older members are struggling with it the same way. But of course, we are working on digital education in our parliaments. So welcome back. I will just shortly sum up everything for you. So after Molly's input, we just take a few questions who go directly to her. So we had a bit of discussion about Johnson and the Conservatives, about trade deals and cherry picking, and the final one was about situation in Northern Ireland. So that's the short sum up. But now the floor should be yours with your statement about what's going on in Scotland, because we have some questions to this as well. Of course, we saved them for you. And what's with the young people in the UK?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and apologies for that delay. Some of my colleagues in the Parliament are determined that their inability to use the internet is somehow the Parliament's problem and not theirs. But we got there in the end, and the vote was very relevant to what we're discussing with Brexit tonight, so I'll come on to it. I'm sad I missed the question on Northern Ireland. I actually sit on one of the bodies that monitors and manages the peace process in Northern Ireland, so it's an issue that I feel very passionate about. I'll start off by just talking a little bit about the direct impact on young people, some of the very specific ways in which Brexit will impact young people in Scotland, across the UK and across Europe. And then I'll talk about the constitutional dimension to this in Scotland and the question of our country's independence. The first and most obvious way that Brexit is impacting young people here is around freedom of movement, not as an abstract right. When we talk about the ability that all European citizens have to live, to work, to study anywhere else in the Union, it sounds here to a lot of our citizens as something that's very middle class, something that is out of the reach of working class people in our country, that young people from working class areas on lower incomes with less of what we would call social capital feel that the idea that they would be able to do that is unrealistic. So they may have had the right, but they never had the ability to live, work, study elsewhere because of economic inequality and social inequality. But the huge success of freedom of movement for young people in our country, and breaking past that just being for middle class young people, has been with the Erasmus Plus programme. Erasmus has a reputation in the United Kingdom of historically being something for university students who are generally come from more affluent, more middle class backgrounds. But what Erasmus Plus has achieved is it has allowed young people from youth groups, youth clubs, and colleges, tertiary vocational education colleges in some of the poorest areas of our country to take part in these kind of international exchanges. So the combination of their right to freedom of movement and what the Erasmus Plus programme specifically offered opened up European travel and cultural experiences to a lot of young people in some of our poorest communities in a way that they simply would never otherwise have had. And I represent a lot of these communities. I represent an area of the west of Scotland which suffered very badly when heavy industry shut down, when steel, shipbuilding, coal mining, etc. were shut down in the 1980s. Massive, massive levels of child poverty in my area, and young people who would never otherwise get on a plane or a train to travel internationally, but were able to do so through Erasmus Plus. The committee that I sit on in the Scottish Parliament looked into this, looked into how we could continue participating in Erasmus even after the UK has left the European Union. And unfortunately, even if we were to continue participating, many of these youth clubs and further education colleges told us that it wouldn't matter because without freedom of movement as a right, they would not be able to do it. When we get to the point of travel between the UK and the European Union becoming more complicated, which it will, that is simply something that they would not be able to handle the logistics of. They were able to do these trips because it was free and easy and simple, that side of international travel. But there is still the potential for us to participate. There are countries that are not in the European Union that do take part in Erasmus, countries all over the world, not just in the wider European region. What we are looking at the moment is how Scotland could take part even if the UK government decided it wasn't going to. Now, obviously, we hope that the UK as a whole will want to take part in Erasmus, and that participation will be limited, but it is better than nothing. If that were not to be the case, what the Greens have been urging the Scottish government to do is to directly apply for Scotland to be able to participate in Erasmus. That may involve taking the United Kingdom government to court, but everyone is doing that at the moment anyway. The European Union are doing that, so we should have our go at it as well. I've personally done that.
And
it's
you won.
something that we believe is worth a legal challenge, and we're very passionate about it. Looking at our universities though, Scotland per capita, per head of population, has the highest number of the world's top universities. That's largely a legacy of the Scottish Enlightenment. But what that means is Scotland per head of population has benefited more than any other European country from Horizon 2020 funding, from all sorts of research funding for our universities. 1 in 4 of our academic staff at our universities comes from elsewhere in Europe. So we have benefited massively. What happens to replace Horizon 2020 funding? We don't know. Maybe we can participate in some limited way, but again, the UK government won't say what their intentions are. With the academic staff, we have put a lot of work into encouraging people to remain here and to say that they are still very much welcome. Naturally, though, some people have returned home to elsewhere in Europe. They no longer feel welcome in the UK, even in Scotland, and that's unfortunate. One other thing that is unfortunate is European students will have to start paying tuition fees to attend Scottish universities. Until now, Scottish students can attend university for free, so students from elsewhere in Europe are extended that right as well. That will end next year. Scottish students will be able to continue attending our universities for free, but if you want to come from Europe, you will have to pay a fee in the way that any other international student would. I think that's unfortunate. Greens believe that all education should be free. It is a right and it enriches all of us for people to be educated. And we as a country have gained so much from citizens of other European countries coming here to study, and also those who've decided to stay as a result. But even those who don't stay enrich us. Molly mentioned Terry Reinke before. Terry spent a year in Edinburgh while she was a university student, and I know how much that enriched the Green Party here in Scotland to have Terry with us for a year. And that link, that relationship has continued for a long time as a result. Terry and I work very closely together now. Talking about the wider situation for Scotland though, just before I finish up, Scotland is now, for the first time in our history, for the first time in 300 years, in a place where most people in this country want our country to be an independent nation. Most people in Scotland now want Scotland to leave the United Kingdom and become our own nation. We are sitting at about 54–55% support for independence in our opinion polls. That has only started to happen this year. After Brexit happened as a vote in 2016, support for independence went up, but it wasn't sustained. We are now, for the first time ever, in a period where there is sustained majority support for independence. And amongst young people, it is overwhelming. Around 70% of young people in Scotland want our country to be independent. It's worth remembering that Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. 62% of people here voted to stay in the EU. Scotland does not and has never voted for the Conservatives. The last time a right-wing party won in Scotland, it was the predecessor to the Conservatives, and it was 1950. The Conservative Party does not have a mandate to govern this country, but they do. And as Molly explained, because of the UK's voting system, they have absolute power within the UK Parliament. They are a majority government, despite the fact that they have very little support here in Scotland. And through the Brexit process, they had an opportunity, the Conservatives had an opportunity to repair their relationship with Scotland and to demonstrate that Scotland was an integral and important part of the United Kingdom. They did the opposite of that. In many circumstances, the United Kingdom government simply did not understand devolution, our system whereby Scotland has our own parliament and our own government, which is slightly different to your federal system, but there are enough similarities. They didn't care. Many people in the United Kingdom government did not know, for example, that not only is the law separate in Scotland, our legal system is separate, they didn't know that it had always been separate. Scotland has had a parliament for 20 years. The system of Scots law predates the Union. It is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and it has always been different. And they didn't know that. The UK government would offer up proposals to the European Union, to Monsieur Barnier, in negotiations in areas they had no right to propose. And he knew that. Mr. Barnier knew more about Scotland and devolution than the United Kingdom did. The UK's negotiators, who were Scotland's negotiators, didn't understand what they were negotiating on. And that has come to a head right now. What I have just voted on is for the Scottish Parliament to reject consent for the UK government's internal market bill. That is the bill that breaks international law. That is the bill that has resulted in the European Union taking the UK to court, taking legal action. What it does domestically within the UK, though, is grab power from our devolved parliaments in Wales, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and not take it centrally to the UK Parliament, but take it centrally to the UK government. Decisions that we take in the Scottish Parliament in areas that are entirely our responsibility can now be vetoed, can be overruled by the UK government, and they do not even need a vote of the UK Parliament to approve that. This is deeply anti-democratic. It is a direct attack on the Scottish Parliament, which was established after a referendum. It has overwhelming support. Not only does our Parliament have overwhelming support, most people in our country want it to be the only Parliament that makes decisions over our country. They are taking powers away from us, and they can do that. We have rejected consent for this, but because of the way the UK works, they can do it anyway. The UK's legal system, the UK Parliament's legal system, is reliant on a system of parliamentary sovereignty, and they don't mean my Parliament, they only mean the UK Parliament. It can do whatever it wants, and it is passing this bill over our objections. Where does that leave Scotland and the Green Party? Well, the Scottish Greens have always believed in independence. We have always supported our country's independence because we believe that we could do so much more with it. We could be more democratic. We can be a much more just and fairer country. And critically, we have always believed that the only way to secure Scotland's future in the European Union is with independence. Tragically, we have now been proved correct on that. The only way Scotland will become part of the European Union once again, we believe, is with independence. So earlier this year, we relaunched our campaign for independence in Europe, and we were delighted to be joined by Ska Keller, and we have had broad support from across the European Green political family. And we were very encouraged in 2017, in your last manifesto for your federal elections, both Scotland and Northern Ireland were specifically mentioned by the German Green Party, and we drew a lot of strength from that. So we're very optimistic. Independence now has majority support in Scotland. Rejoining the European Union has overwhelming support. A majority of our parliament support both of these things. And next year, we will go into a new parliamentary election where if the pro-independence parties win another majority, which we are very confident of doing, we will have a mandate to hold a referendum on independence. And once we achieve independence, we can begin the process of rejoining the European Union. So that's the positive note that I will end that contribution on.
So thank you. You answered the question very exactly, which was, is Brexit giving additional arguments for Scottish independence? I think the answer is yes. So this has been very clearly. Just for you to know, I sent in the chat our concept of how to improve youth exchange, because it was topic again. I'm sorry, it's in German. We do not have a translated version now, but if we will get one, I will send it over to you. And not only Terry visited Scotland for an exchange, I did as well, but just for 1 week in my 7th class as a student. I guess my school still has a exchange with the Edinburgh Academy. So it was quite interesting to have a look on this as well a few years ago. So let's see, are there other people who want to take the floor?
Do you want to give Ross a go at the question on Northern Ireland, because he has a lot of insight into that?
Okay, yeah, of course we can do so. So Ross, that's a good idea. Maybe, as you mentioned, you are part of a board there on this topic, so maybe you can give us some additional information about the Northern Ireland question, and of course it's connected to internal market bill and everything.
Yes, it's a massive subject, so I'll try to be very brief, but it's worth bearing in mind from the start that most English Conservatives, and I mean the government, not all people who vote Conservative in England, but the English Conservative Party basically think Wales is part of England, that Scotland should just do what England tells it, and they have forgotten that Northern Ireland exists. And it was a huge surprise to them in 2016 for the UK to vote for Brexit as a whole, but for them to discover that actually this was very complicated in Northern Ireland. What they want are two incompatible things. On the one hand, they want the UK to leave the European Customs Union so that we can negotiate trade deals that are entirely independent of European Union trade policy and existing trade deals. But they also want to keep the border in Northern Ireland, the border in Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Republic, entirely open, because that is part of the Good Friday Agreement. It is part of the peace process. Those two things are not compatible unless you create a new border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's not acceptable to unionists in Northern Ireland. So you end up in a situation where either the nationalist community loses out by a border being created on land between Northern Ireland and the Republic, or the unionist community feel they have lost out by a border being created between Northern Ireland on the one hand and Scotland, Wales and England on the other hand. The Conservatives consistently said that this would be easy to sort out and never came up with a proposal for sorting it out, which is why we are in the position we are now, where they intend to specifically break international law in this area. That is them trying to square a circle that simply cannot be squared. The reality is, if we are to maintain peace on the island of Ireland and to make sure that neither the nationalist nor the unionist community feel they have lost out, we have to stay either in the European Customs Union or entirely aligned to it. So for all intents and purposes, stay in. And this is not abstract. When we talk about peace in Northern Ireland, we have to understand that the war ended, but the conflict did not. Paramilitary groups still exist in Northern Ireland. Some of them are still active. There are dissident Republicans who are still armed and who would attempt to restart the conflict. There are loyalist paramilitaries who would also attempt to fight violently any attempt at creating a border that they object to. These groups are still active, and occasionally people are still hurt or even killed by them. The war is over, but that doesn't mean Northern Ireland is entirely at peace. But the Conservatives don't seem to care. They risk reigniting that conflict very significantly by a combination of not caring about and not understanding anything about Northern Ireland. Sorry, I said I would be brief and then I was not.
I think 4 minutes about Northern Ireland is quite brief, so that's fine. Yeah, I think we will see if there's somebody else who wants to take the floor, Antonia, then we will give him or her the chance.
Yeah, so, and we also had a lot of positive comments regarding the point you made with the Erasmus program. I just wanted to say that. And we have another risen hand by Mr. Brinkman. I don't know, he was the one who posed the question about independence, but maybe he still wants to add something. So yeah, if you would like to, you can speak now.
I asked a question about Scottish independence because was really very clearly explained the situation, and I couldn't agree more. What I see is that Great Britain will become Little England because the Good Friday Agreement stipulates as well that if both sides of the border agree in a national referendum to join, then the British government cannot say no. And the European Union is a guarantor for that Good Friday Agreement. So I think there is a leverage point for the European Union in that respect. But I wanted to ask you a different question. I think what you haven't yet touched upon, which I think is something that is driving probably the considerations of a lot of people, not just in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but as well in England. What are the economic impacts of a Brexit? We have got, or the Bank of England just suggested that the national income will drop by 8.5%, but in 2020 they didn't make any forecasts for 21. If on top of, but that is just because of Corona. If on top of that you get Brexit, what will be the economic impact and the impact on jobs and investment, etc.?
Thank you, Walter. I mentioned Walter and I now quite good. He's head of the Munich section of the European Union organization.
It's the parallel organization to the European movement, and I was for 7 years sitting on the board of the European movement in Oxford.
Great.
So I know the European movement quite well.
Thanks for your question, Walter. I'm not sure who wants to answer first. Maybe Molly, she's the economic one. I can give a few words about Bavaria, and maybe Ross has a few words about Scotland.
I'm not only the economic one, but I am an economist. I am a professor of economics. I just was feeling a little bit desperate there by that chat about Scotland, because I'm actually Welsh, but I live in the West Country. So I hope that if we do end up in a situation of Little England, perhaps we'll go back to the sort of kingdoms before King Arthur, and then I can join Wessex then, or I can go over to Cambria. I mean, the thought of being stuck with all those Brexiteers down in London is just intolerable. So please don't lump me in with them. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the economic impacts, as you say, are devastating to all sorts of sectors. But this argument was not effective during the campaign. It was not convincing, and there was a sort of level of emotional mobilization which just sidelined all these arguments. And as I said, that's why I believe we have to go through the pain of this now, because that's the only way that people will be convinced that what we said was true. And it's interesting during the negotiations, because obviously the biggest sector here as far as the British government is concerned and the British economy is the finance sector. And yet you barely hear that discussed in conversations about what's happening with the negotiations, which I find quite intriguing. I'm sure it's being talked about, it's just not being briefed to journalists. And it actually is the one sector where, in a way, the EU needs us more than we need them, because London is the European financial centre, and it will still be that in January. And I know that the EU is putting in place plans to shift a lot of that activity into the Capital Markets Union, but it's going to take quite a number of years to do that. So it's interesting that there probably is some leverage there, but we don't hear about it. I wonder what's going on there. But I also think it's really clear that the sort of future that the British Conservatives have got in mind for the city is not one where the EU would want that activity to have access into the single market. For example, tax haven activity, money laundering. We've seen a lot of Russian money laundering in London. The EU always sort of turned a blind eye to that when we were part of of course, as a Green on the Economics and Monetary Policy Committee, I tried very hard to fight against that. But, there was not enough action taken by the EU against money laundering and using London as a tax haven. But obviously, once we're outside, I hope that will be, firstly, it's worrying that the Tories will want to encourage that kind of activity, but secondly, it's another reason that the EU doesn't want that kind of infecting the European economy. And of course, the other thing is, which I think has been discussed explicitly, the fact that the British government will intend us to be some kind of outpost with screwdriver operations, with low standards, low environmental and social standards, producing goods cheaply and then importing them into the single market. And that's what the level playing field is designed to stop. And, this is why I need Barnier to stay strong on that, and also to be backed up by the European Parliament if there's any sense of pressure at the end of the negotiations and those standards might be put at risk, because that is what will trash the European project in the single market and mustn't be allowed to happen.
Ross, do you want to follow up with Scotland or a few words about economic issues?
Yeah, the economic impact of Brexit is now becoming very hard to assess because the economic impact of the pandemic, the virus, is so massive. But we know that Brexit will make it much worse. Before the virus, we were doing a lot of projections, a lot of impact assessments on what it might mean, and they were all terrible. Scotland's economy is more exposed than the UK economy as a whole to the damage of Brexit because of the sectors that dominate here. So agriculture and tourism are a much higher share of Scotland's economy than they are the UK as a whole. But because of the way the UK government have negotiated Brexit, because of the loss of freedom of movement rights, because of the new immigration system they've proposed, for example, we know that will hit our economy a lot harder than it will elsewhere. I challenged the head immigration advisor to the United Kingdom government on this, who simply said, well, some sectors of the economy will have to contract, some sectors will have to get smaller. The sectors he was talking about are the biggest sectors in Scotland, and he either didn't know that or didn't care, and it doesn't really matter either way because that's what they're doing. Scotland has for centuries gone through a process of depopulation. Our population did not grow for a long time on the whole. Huge numbers of people left Scotland for elsewhere through the British Empire or other places, but we also had the issue of people from Scotland going down, particularly to London and the southeast of England. It was only in 2004 that the Scottish population began to properly grow, and that was with the accession to the European Union of a number of Eastern European countries. Because of freedom of movement, we were able to attract people of working age from the rest of Europe to come and work in Scotland, particularly in our rural communities, not just seasonal labourers, not just seasonal workers, but that's very important. The risk of losing that for us has between 2 and 4 times the impact as it does to the rest of the UK. Our agricultural sector, picking soft fruit, for example, will be devastated by this because there simply won't be enough people to do it. But it will also impact public services like social care and the health service, because a huge number of people who have come to Scotland to work in those areas have come from the rest of the European Union, either as seasonal workers who will not be allowed, or, for example, even some nurses will not meet the income, the pay threshold that the UK government are setting out for this. So the economic impact across the board, we know, will be devastating. Supply chains will be disrupted. The administrative cost of the new customs barrier will force a lot of smaller businesses to close. On top of all of that, on top of everything that affects the UK as a whole, the sectors like tourism and agriculture, who will be hit the hardest, are the biggest sectors of our economy, and there is almost nothing we can do to protect them from that.
Thanks a lot. So we are discussing the economical issues in Bavaria as well a lot, of course. There will be the biggest change on the 1st of January, or not, at least there will be a lot of uncertainty. So our projections say there will be a GDP loss up to 2%, depending on what will really happen in January. So from a Bavarian perspective, it's mainly mechanical engineering, vehicle industry, pharmaceutical industry a bit, and all about data transfer and stuff like this will be hit hardest from Brexit. Especially in mechanical engineering and vehicle industry, we have a lot of, you could say, inter-industrial exchange, where parts go to Britain and other parts come back to build up a car or something like this. And of course, they are not sure what will happen to those supply chains. And yeah, we will have to see. But now, yeah, we will try to prepare the economy as good as we can, but of course it's difficult to prepare for something you do not really know how it will end, and that's the biggest problem, especially for smaller businesses who do not have the money for a Brexit task force or so. Like the big financial ones, of course, they decided, okay, which parts we have to take to Frankfurt or which parts we have to take anywhere else in Europe, but the smaller businesses are struggling with this. So I guess I want to ask one question myself. Of course, we had a lot of discussion about the freedom of movement this evening. And when Corona starts, it was like a shutdown for the European freedom of movement, of course. And it was interesting for me because it was the first time I was really working on, okay, how we are able that families living in two different countries, one in Bavaria, one in Austria, can meet again. How we are able that people who are working in Austria and have to pass the border each day can do this. And it was like people realized that Europe brought lots of things, they were really used to it. And now from one day to the other, they were not able to take them, like the freedom of movement, and it was a moment of realization. And I was questioning if Corona had like the same impact in UK, that people were questioning, okay, hey, this European Union brought some things which would be helpful to stay to, yeah. So has there been a Corona really impact on the European, on the opinion on the European Union and the Brexit?
There have been a few interesting examples, not specifically related to freedom of movement and direct impact on families, but for example, when the European Union in, I think maybe April or May, coordinated the manufacture and supply of ventilators for hospitals across the continent, the EU gave the United Kingdom government the opportunity to take part in that, and the United Kingdom government chose not to, for no practical reason, purely for either an ideological reason, because they are a pro-Brexit government, or incompetence. They did not read the email, I believe was the excuse that they gave. So there have been these stories of how the European Union was trying to help, and the UK government either turned that down or wasn't capable of taking the help. Unfortunately, the stories around, for example, the relief package that was agreed at European Union level, which is relatively green, the recovery money that's being put in, that did not get much coverage here. The European Union got very little media coverage when the UK was in it, and now that we are not in it, it gets even less. So we're in a situation now where, for the families who are directly affected by the kind of issues that you mentioned of being able to travel freely back and forward, this means a huge amount to them. But for the overwhelming majority of the population, unless they're in that situation themselves, or they know someone who's in that situation, it's just not something that they've quite noticed. The ventilator issue was one that people did notice, and we were very angry about it because Scotland did want to take part in ventilator procurement, but we could not because the UK was the nation state, and the UK, for whatever reason, decided not to.
I would just add to that something that's a bit more cultural and less practical, which is that I think COVID has and will continue to change our perception about where we live, how we move, how secure we are in our lives. And in my view, all of those things, you know, Brexit feels like such a luxury now, such an absurd luxury compared to the sort of massive crisis that we're in. And I do think if it had come 6 months earlier, we would have reversed the decision. So it's a great tragedy, obviously, that it came at all, but you know, the timing couldn't have been worse. But the other really intriguing thing was that Brexit was all about borders and boundaries. And so what we could have done was what New Zealand did. You know, we're an island. We could have closed the border and quarantined very carefully and stopped the virus coming in. This would have been a rare opportunity to actually see something positive around keeping control of our borders. And we had that control. And other European countries did that. But the UK government actually implemented border controls less than almost any country in the world. People were flying in from New York at the height of the pandemic, then getting straight on the tube, infecting people across London. Most of the cases that came in originally was people on skiing holidays coming in from Italy, who could have been put in hotels like they were in Korea, in South Korea. But this I think demonstrates so clearly Brexit as an absurd ideological project. Because if the government had really been concerned about getting control of the borders, here was a time when they really needed to do that. And they just didn't do that at all. So yeah, it just shows that Brexit is essentially ideological nonsense. Because I'm not a big person for borders, but then I would have used borders to protect public health, and they just didn't even think of doing that.
Thanks. So Antonia, are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's a question about the economic aspect. So to Molly, is being a tax haven and a good place for money laundering on a great scale one of the reasons parts of the rich elite support Brexit?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it was. You know, we still don't really have the facts about this because the British government hasn't investigated, but there was a report recently which was eventually published like 9 months after it was written, into Russian interference in British democracy. And it was a very serious moment, and the people who presented that report came forward and said, you know, we know that something's happened, but we can't tell you very much because there hasn't been an investigation. And guess what? There still hasn't been an investigation. And what kind of a government would accept, would understand that a foreign power, a really quite dangerous and unpleasant foreign government, had interfered in its democracy, and yet it wouldn't investigate? I tell you, the answer to that question is a government that was receiving Russian money. I find it difficult to find any other explanation for why the British government has not investigated Putin's collusion in both Brexit and democratic elections in this country. We know that there's strong links between the British Conservative Party and various Russian oligarchs. We know that London operates as a kind of laundromat for Russian money, and yet we don't know exactly what's going on because nobody is investigating. Our security services were asleep on the job, and our government is basically engaged, is benefiting from dirty Russian money. So that's just a part of it. I mean, after the end of empire, we continue to be rich by exploiting some of our former possessions across the world, and they turned into tax havens, and they operated through the city of London, and this was the kind of sea of dirty money that kept the UK. If you look at the UK, what do we make? What jobs do we do? So much of what we used to do has gone, but the city's still there, and it's the heart. This is what I learned through consecutive tax committees in the European Parliament, that London sits at the heart of the nasty web of the global tax avoidance industry. And yes, it'll be one of the things we can sell, money laundering services to Russians who can then use our excellent London schools and live in safety while people in their home country are murdered on the streets. That's unfortunately the sort of future that I think the British government has in mind.
It's worth sometimes seeing Brexit as being almost a fight between the two different wings of the British capitalist class, the Britain's capitalist elite. On one side, you have the neoliberals who have benefited a lot from the European single market and who've made that single market worse, not better, but who've got rich from it. And on the other side, you have the disaster capitalists, the ones who are the most heavily involved in tax avoidance, the ones who made a huge amount of money during the 2008 recession and will make a huge amount of money now. Brexit is essentially, or was motivated by, a fight between these two different wings of the economic elite, and it's the rest of the country suffering as a result. And it's worth noting the people who are playing both sides of that. So I don't know whether you know Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a member of the British government. He's the one that makes the news a lot because he's this strange parody of what a British politician might have looked and sounded like 200 years ago, or at least 100 years ago. Jacob Rees-Mogg is an ideological Brexiteer who will make a lot of money out of the British economy tanking. At the same time, he has moved some of his investments to Dublin so that some of his companies stay inside the European single market and keep making money that way. So there are two different wings of the capitalist class fighting each other. But there's also quite a lot of people who sit in both of those wings because no matter what happens, they will continue making money, and it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the country. But that is really just a summary of Britain's ruling elite. It has always been a sociopathic dedication to advancing their own self-interest. It doesn't matter what happens to the tens of millions of other people who live in the country.
But it's all right, Ross, because you can watch, all those lovely films like Gosford Park and Downton Abbey. So don't worry, they're lovely people, really.
That's it. We're all socially conditioned to believe that the British aristocracy are like harmless, and they're the best people to run the country. Having a posh accent means that you're qualified to run this country. No, like Britain is clearly ran by idiots who went to the best schools, but idiots nonetheless. But we're socially conditioned to believe that because they are from the upper class, they are the aristocracy, they have this natural right to rule. And that's because, as Molly said, Britain's not a real democracy. And we also have the problem that almost no other European country has. There was never a democratic revolution in Britain. There was never a revolution where the old order were destroyed in the way that most other European countries have. We're still basically this kind of semi-feudal system ran by the same mad aristocrats who were running it centuries ago.
Agreed.
Okay, thanks for this very interesting insight in British society. I want to arise one last topic before our talk runs out of time. And of course, we had two written questions to it. The questions ask what's about BBC and how it's going on, but I want to broaden this a bit, having a look on the role of media and public media in all the Brexit process, because this is something which is a very hot topic in all over Europe as well, because we have large influence of a few governments, for example, in Hungary or in Poland on the media and the public media, which takes a lot of democratic problems. But maybe you can give us a few insight about the role of media and how BBC will go on.
Yeah,
well, I'll let Ross speak first because he's on a media committee, so he's got power in this area.
Yeah, this is a shared passion of Molly and I's, or certainly getting very angry at the BBC sometimes is. The BBC is a wonderful institution. It is an amazing public service broadcaster, but it has really serious internal issues. And part of it is the BBC's budget has been cut by a huge amount. Hundreds of millions of pounds have been taken out of the BBC's budget by right-wing governments. And senior staff at the BBC are afraid of being accused by those right-wing governments of having a left-wing bias. So they overcompensate for that. And often the right are allowed a free rein in the way that people on the left would never be. We have so-called think tanks who are front groups for corporate interests, both here and in America. They are the people who played a huge role in driving Brexit and who are now pushing very hard for disastrous trade deals with the United States, for example. They are allowed free rein on the BBC, and no one ever asks, but who funds you, what is your agenda, etc. So there are big issues with the BBC. It is essentially afraid of the right, and as a result, it overcompensates itself. But there are people on the right who are genuinely obsessed with the BBC as being what they would describe as culturally Marxist, because these people are mad and they think that anything that's not their hard right agenda must be Marxist. There are wider issues with the media. Britain's print media is owned almost exclusively by 4 billionaires. We don't have a free press in a true, meaningful sense of the word. Our print media is overwhelmingly right-wing. It is overwhelmingly owned by a couple of billionaires. The editorial positions they take are very similar, and it affects different parts of the UK differently. So Scotland does have our own national press. We have our own national newspapers that are different from the UK-wide papers, and that's good. They're not brilliant papers, but it's good. Wales doesn't have that. There is no Welsh national media. So Welsh media is like second-hand English media much of the time. There are real issues around media plurality across the UK and getting that range of voices in there. And that has been a right-wing project for the last 30 years to undermine a balanced media, to undermine the BBC as a public service broadcaster. And it has really paid off for them. We're in a position now where these front groups for American pharmaceutical companies can come on and advocate selling off our National Health Service, privatizing it, and they're presented as if they are independent think tanks, academics, etc. They're not. They are paid by American pharmaceutical companies to do that, and the BBC won't ask. It will just let them on to do it. What we need to strike a careful balance as progressives is defending the institution of a public service broadcaster, defending the BBC as a wonderful institution, whilst taking it on when it makes these mistakes, taking on these massive structural problems, which I've been trying to do with the Director General. One of the committees I sit on, the BBC reports to it, but it's hard because even the Labour Party will not support people like myself and Molly when we make these points, because these same shady think tanks have wormed their way into the Labour Party as well, because it's not a very progressive party. So there are big challenges in how we can have a media that actually accurately represents the country at large, because at the moment we've got a public service broadcaster that's terrified and newspapers that are owned by a small number of billionaires who largely support Brexit and are very much against any effort to tackle the climate crisis.
I would just add a few things to that. Obviously, I agree entirely with what Ross said, but firstly, there is a Welsh language media, which is better, but tiny minority sport. It's an absolute tragedy what's happened to the BBC. I'm actually more cynical, I would say, than Ross. I don't think it's about political pressure. I think it's a deliberate operation, and I've had conversations with a sequence of people who control the political content at the BBC, and that was the conclusion I came to. And of course, Robbie Gibb was a key person who took over deciding which politicians would be represented and how politics would be represented shortly before, I think it was the January of 2016, and then went to work for Theresa May at Downing Street. So I think, you know, that's just one example of the kind of way that politically people were sent in a kind of operation to destroy the independence of the BBC, and it is an absolute tragedy. And the biggest tragedy is that the BBC has lost trust, and it was, along with the NHS, I would say it was one of our most trusted institutions, and it's completely lost that trust and credibility now, which is, you know, the value of having a public service broadcaster that people believe, even to the government, is huge, and they've just squandered that. Just give a few examples of what Ross was talking about there. Let's take the Barclay brothers, who live in one of the Channel Islands because it's a tax haven. They own the Telegraph and the Spectator. The Telegraph paid Boris Johnson £200,000 a year for one column. In other words, they bankrolled him to do his far-right politics. They also, I think their former editor is Charles Moore, who's now been put forward as the next CEO of the BBC. They also have the Spectator, where Andrew Neil worked, who is one of the guys that works with the US think tanks and was a key political interviewer here, also somebody driving Brexit. So, you know, the way that there's this nexus between ownership of media, cash, obviously, tax avoidance, and key mouthpieces for this far-right agenda is extremely murky and very worrying, and much more something you would expect to find in an authoritarian country like Turkey or, you know, Hungary, as you said, than you would expect to find in a flourishing democracy. Another, perhaps the worst example, is the Daily Express, owned by Lord Rothermere, founded by his grandfather in the 30s, at which time it was very anti-Semitic and supported Hitler. I mean, it's not overtly supporting fascism at the moment, but covertly you might argue that it is. And Richard Desmond, who's a former editor there, has also been proposed for one of the top jobs at the BBC. So, you know, it's very worrying times. And I think the key thing is what Ross said: this is not a free press. A free press means people are free to express their opinions. This is not what's happening. This is a bought and sold media that we have in Britain, and I've given some examples. But then, of course, you have the examples of people who are paid then to reproduce opinions they don't believe. It's their job to produce lies, and so on and so on. So essentially, we don't have a free press, and without a free press, you don't have a democracy. The British Green Party has a very strong proposal that nobody should own more than 20% of media outlets. Perhaps you should go even further than that. And nobody who isn't resident and paying tax in the UK can own anything at all. And that would really clean out the Georgian stables in one fell swoop.
It's worth just briefly saying, unfortunately, we're heading in the opposite direction, where Andrew Neil, whom Molly mentioned from the Spectator magazine, hard right magazine, who defended Golden Dawn, who today have finally been declared a mafia organisation. As well as that, he was the BBC's chief interviewer. He's about to launch a new TV channel that is being characterised as Britain's answer to Fox News. So it's about to get worse, not better.
Okay, thanks. I guess fighting for independent public media is something which, aligns Greens all over Europe. So it's a really hard fight, of course. In Germany as well, we see that there are far-right parties attacking independent public media. Quite a problem. In the moment, it's at least in Bavaria, it's a bit better because the far-right are more, discussing and fighting with each other than having the time to think about attacks on independent public media. But having an eye on this is as well one of our big topics and issues. I'm very sorry to the audience, because our time is running out. As every talk has to end, this one has reached the 19 minutes we usually use. It has been a pleasure to have both of you here online. It's great that at least this thing is good about Corona, that people are very open to digital formats and discussions, which offers me the opportunity to have two guests from the UK with a lot of interesting insights and what's going on. I hope that we will meet in person one day, or next year, or the year after. Let's see to this, because actually I planned to do like a Brexit trip, to do a last trip to UK before borders are closed or so, but there was no possibility because of Corona. I both wish you a nice evening. Thanks for participating, and thank the audience for all the questions. I know there might be few unanswered ones, but I hope there will be future possibilities to get those questions answered. Then have a nice evening, and I will